Thank you all for joining us once again for our Sunday night at Fifth Avenue Synagogue programming. Our guest speaker tonight is Eric Goldstein, the CEO of the UJA Federation of New York. And his topic will be the impact of COVID-19 on the future of the Jewish community. And to formally introduce Eric is his highly talented sister, Sandra. And Sandra and her husband, Ziggy, and family are longtime members of the Fifth Avenue Synagogue. They are truly wonderful people who have helped our community in so many different ways. Sandra is a former synagogue director and helped lead the community for many, many years. Ziggy, her husband, was a co-chair of the men's club for many years at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. And they have an annual tradition to help us sponsor the Simchas Torah Children's Program and all their gifts that they give out to the children. Ziggy, we have a conversation every single year about what to give out. It's a very important project for the family to enhance the children's experience of Simchas Torah. And we hope the tradition and the involvement of the shul continues on for many, many years. It's a true honor to have the members of our community. And it's a privilege to call upon Sandra to formally introduce tonight's guest speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi Babbage. It's very kind. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is safe and healthy. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing Eric Goldstein, the CEO of UJA Federation of New York, who I am very proud to be able to call my brother. Eric has quite a unique perspective, having spent 30 years in the private sector as a very accomplished and successful litigator at Paul Weiss, which is one of the top Wall Street law firms in the country, before turning his sights full-time to the public sector at UJA. Eric has been very involved in community service and Jewish charity his whole life. He was 13 years old during the Yom Kippur War. My father was then the president of our shul and held an appeal during, I believe it was Sukkot, for I think UJA in light of the war. And Eric, even at that young age, was extremely integral in that campaign. He particularly focused on the young people in the shul and getting them involved and donating, again, at that very young age. So Eric is a great guy with many terrific qualities. For one thing, we know he's courageous, because allowing your sister to introduce you, particularly in a setting like this where he can't nudge me off the stage or take away my microphone, is pretty risky. So for example, she could hypothetically talk about all the card games and board games that were played growing up, where he said maybe that he had won and maybe others in the family thought that that might not have been exactly accurate. And you know, the consensus in the family might have been somewhat different. I better stop now because he gets to go after me. And anyway, just as a for example, we know he's courageous. But he's a lot more. He's also a leader, and here too, he showed all his life very mature leadership qualities, including at a very young age. My mother, just as an example, my mother ran for judgeship when Eric was 17, and although others were very much involved in the campaign, Eric truly ran that campaign, from making sure that all the election laws were complied with, to figuring out strategies and tactics for my mother to win, which she did, again, thanks in large part to Eric. So it's probably not a big surprise that Eric ultimately became involved in leadership positions in so many charities and Jewish institutions. As president and chairman of Manhattan Day School, he's been on the board of Ramaz, Dill Road, New York Legal Assistance Group, president of Beit Din of America, and that's really just to name a few. And the truth is, Eric doesn't just help Jews. He protects and cares about everyone. He's not only gone to Israel many times to help during very dangerous situations while rockets are flying, and also been involved in the emigration of Jews from Russia and Ethiopia, helping spirit them to Israel. But he also, for example, went into Puerto Rico during the hurricanes to deliver food and supplies for that community as well. And I've certainly personally witnessed Eric's protective instincts my whole life. He's always very much watched over his little sister. For years, when I was in elementary school and he was in high school, every morning as I left to go to the school bus, which is just a couple of blocks away, he would go up to the porch of our home. We had an upstairs porch, and he'd go up and go out and watch to make sure that I crossed the street safely and got to the bus stop safely. My parents had no idea that was happening. I had no idea that was happening. I put a stop to it when I found out, but that's just who he is. Those are his good, kind, protective instincts. So, bottom line, Eric is a mensch. He's extremely hardworking, fiercely dedicated and loyal to friends, to family, and to community, and he's certainly the best brother a sister could ask for. So, without further ado, I very proudly introduce my big brother, Eric GOLDSTEIN.
So we can stop the program here and just say good night. That was amazing. But the reality is, thank you. That was really overly sweet. My sister has always been and will always be the baby in my family. She's the youngest child, but she very modestly didn't say, Rabbi Babbage alluded it to briefly, her achievements outshine all of us. And, you know, I have to say I'm delighted that my mother, who became an honorary member of your shul this evening and joined the Zoom call with my father, blazed the way as a woman lawyer and a judge at a time when very few women did that. But Sandra very much followed in that path and has become one of the most prominent lawyers, male or female, in the country today. So really special to be introduced by my baby sister, and also very special, I understand my parents are watching this on Zoom as well. So thank you for having me, Rabbi Batovich, Jacob Gold, Ezra Merkin, Rachel Ackman-Gold. Thanks really to all of you for inviting me. So I've been asked to speak about the impact of COVID-19 on the future of the Jewish community. And before we turn to the future, I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about the present, because we're certainly not in a post-COVID-19 world. It's not even clear when we will be, but it's important to talk about these past 4 months since roughly March 1, when COVID really hit New York. I think it's important to start by saying that long before COVID hit, there was enormous vulnerability in the New York Jewish community. I think a little bit out of the spotlight for many of us. UJA does a large decennial study every 10 or so years. The last one was about to do one again, but the last one was in 2011. And it found that there were roughly 1.5 million Jews in the 5 boroughs of New York City, Westchester, Long Island. And of that 1.5 million Jews, roughly, a third of the Jews lived at or near poverty. Who are they? They're elderly, many from the former Soviet Union, who came before, after they had the opportunity to build a social security cushion, single parents, people from the Haredi community, people with mental illness or other disabilities and challenges. So we had a huge challenge in the Jewish community before COVID. Bottom line, everyone who was vulnerable before COVID is that much more vulnerable today. And then there are a whole host of people who are getting by, who never sought assistance of any sort, who are now, because of COVID and loss of employment opportunities, suddenly, very suddenly, vulnerable. So I want to talk a little bit about UJA's response. I'll be brief about this. As many of you know, UJA supports a wide array of nonprofits, including social service agencies that care for the elderly, Holocaust survivors, children at risk, people with mental health challenges, the poor and near poor. But we also support a large network of nonprofits that enable Jewish life to flourish, Jewish community centers, Hillels on college campuses, summer camps, day schools, shuls, and much more. Since March 1, the start of the pandemic in New York, we've allocated over $46 million in emergency funding above and beyond our regular allocations, comprised of approximately $20 million in grants and $26 million in interest-free loans. The question though, and it's important to where we go from talking about the future, how do you make those allocation priorities at a time of such extraordinary challenge and staggering need? So there's no right answer. Our answer was to first focus on the social service sector, to focus on the urgent, unmet needs of the most vulnerable in the community. And it's hard to overstate the challenge from the perspective of even certainly mid-March into April and May. Many of the social service agencies serving our community rely on government funding, government contracts to operate. But even in normal times, government contracts cover 80 to 85 cents of what these social service agencies do. And during normal times, philanthropy is called upon to cover that 15 to 20% in gap between what the government covers and what's necessary. For example, UJA, we're the largest philanthropic supporter of senior centers in the New York area, where typically tens of thousands of elderly each day come for meals and for socialization, for programming. Well, COVID hits, and these senior centers have to shut their doors. They're no longer allowed to remain open, but the seniors they serve still need the meals. They still need socialization, particularly given the isolation of being at home. The need for these services grow. So the social service agencies had to immediately pivot to figure out new methods of delivering their services to people who are no longer coming into their own facilities. And on top of having to figure out how to perform that service, they also had to take into account the need to spend significant additional dollars on personal protective equipment for seniors, for the staff. So we allocated approximately $26 million to these social service agencies, some of it in interest-free loans, just to give them the opportunity to catch their breaths as the government, which was more focused on the healthcare war, appropriately so, had to figure out how to develop new government contracts and begin flowing additional funds to meet the new needs of addressing the social service sector challenge. What was true with senior centers, just as another example, was even more true with food pantries. We're the largest funder of kosher food to food pantries in the New York area through our partner, Met Council. The need for food skyrocketed just at the time when many food pantries had to physically close their food pantries for health concerns and needed to pivot to find ways to deliver. Many of the people who serve at food pantries are volunteers, many of them baby boomers. They weren't allowed to be volunteers. So again, you had to figure out how to provide for the needs of critical social services at a time of staggering challenge with everything changing around you. Perhaps most sobering, just as again, another example of the social service side, we were approached by our partner, the Hebrew Free Burial Association, which tragically was experiencing an unprecedented demand for burials of families who couldn't afford Jewish burials. I mean, they were finding 40, 50, 60, 70, 80% the demand of normal. And so we provided an emergency grant to them. It's the emergency period. I've been in this role for 6 years, starting in July 1st of 2014. There was nothing that could have prepared us for the needs of this moment. And we're still trying to catch up, as is the entire community. But let's pivot from the social service sector to the Jewish life institutions. On some level, the challenges there are perhaps greater because unlike the social service sector, which receives significant government funding to cover their day in and day out needs, the Jewish life institutions, the Jewish community centers, the camps, the shuls, the yeshivas, the day schools, they're not getting government funds. And many of them are built on a fee-for-service model, philanthropy to support themselves. And so these organizations have been hit. Our first focus was on the 22 Jewish community centers in the New York 5 boroughs, Westchester, Long Island. They're an anchor for hundreds of thousands of Jews on a daily basis. They too had to close, most of them. Some of them became emergency centers for New York City employees. But their needs skyrocketed. So we made a $10 million grant and interest-free loan, a combination, to help sustain the JCCs through the first days of the crisis. We gave a $2 million grant to day schools. It's a matching grant, which we know that parents are going to now have a hard time, many of them who have been hit. The scholarship needs of day schools and yeshivas are only going to grow. And so we want to incent those who still can to give in a greater way to day schools and yeshivas. So we've put together a $2 million fund, which will match new dollars that come in to support individual day schools. We allocated $6 million to Jewish summer camps, day camps, and residential camps, which, as we know, are extraordinarily important gateways for Jewish engagement, particularly for those children, many, who don't go to day schools and for whom Jewish camp, day camp and sleepaway residential camp, represent the essential connections to Jewish life. These organizations spend 10 months of the year preparing for 2 months of work. The residential camps actually did not open. They were mandated to stay closed over the summer. Many of them are going to have a hard time reopening because they're in very significant financial straits. Some of the day camps open, some have not, but they too have significant challenges ahead. So those were just a few examples on the social service sector and on the Jewish life infrastructure of the emergency response phase. We're now focusing on the recovery, reopening phase in New York, but recognizing that there's still dramatic uncertainty. Will we really reopen in a normal way? It seems, with our public schools only being open 1 to 3 days a week, it's clear we're not going to reopen in a normal way. And so there still may be. Will there be a second wave in the New York community? When will there be a vaccine? So we're still not in a sort of a very neat emergency response to recovery. We're focused on the recovery phase, but it's not at all clear that we won't be right back into the emergency response phase. So there's still enormous unpredictability ahead in terms of the needs of community across all of these sectors. So the future. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the future of the Jewish community? And just a few observations. There are certain things, mostly we don't know. There are certain things we do know. What do we know? We know there will be less money. There will be less philanthropic giving. There will be less earned income from fee-for-service programs at Jewish communal organizations. And we know there will be less funding from government. So we know that the Jewish community will be asked to do more because the needs are greater than they've ever been in most of our lifetimes, but we know that they're going to be asked to do it with less. Needs grow, but less resource to address those needs. So the first thing we're going to need to do as a community, and that we need to do individually as an organization, is prioritize. There's the nice to have, and there's the need to have. And we need to be laser focused as a community on the need to have. What are those things that we need to have to sustain our Jewish community moving forward? And I think that there are lots of very critical questions. We're an organization that gives significant funding locally, but we've given billions of dollars in our history to the state of Israel, to the former Soviet Union. How do you rationalize today support between various priorities? So there's this concept, Aniye Ircha Kodmem, that at a time of dramatic need, the needs of your own local vulnerable come first. We're not going to abandon by any means Israel or the former Soviet Union. There's still so much work to do there. But I think, at least in the near term, we're going to focus even more of our dollars directly in the community. In the social service sector, we know that the bulge needs are going to be food insecurity, mental health supports. All of us have had mental health challenges. We've all been negatively impacted from a mental health perspective. But think about those who are sick alone, very sick alone, with relatives not able to come to the hospital. Those who had to grieve alone because no one could come to a funeral or to physically give them a hug at a shiva. Or the countless workers on the front lines of the healthcare crisis who are literally in a war zone. Or those who endured domestic abuse without being able to leave their house. Or our teenagers who thought they were going away to gap years or summer camp experiences in Israel. Again, these are all challenges of those who expected to get married and won't be able to, or needs to be late, or will be delayed, or the party and the chasana will look very different than they had expected. All of these challenges are going to need to be addressed by our community, and we do not currently have the mental health resources to provide for the needs of the community. So that's going to be another huge need going forward. And then the final one in the social service in terms of huge needs is workforce development. There are many jobs in New York that are just not coming back anytime soon, if ever. And so we need to do what we can to provide workforce development to make sure that our community is appropriately, has the opportunities it needs. What about Jewish life institutions? As I said, there's a lot of vulnerability. And what I said about vulnerable people who are vulnerable post-COVID are even more vulnerable today. And there are a lot of people who are newly vulnerable. Same is true of Jewish life institutions. Every Jewish life institution that was vulnerable pre-COVID is more vulnerable today. And there are many Jewish life institutions that are newly vulnerable. And it's clear that not all of them will survive. The Jewish life infrastructure as we knew it before COVID is going to look different the day after, whatever that is. So I think, again, we need, and we're not typically as a Jewish people good at this, we have too many Jewish institutions that are redundant, that are doing too many similar things. We need to look with really fresh eyes at how you merge institutions, how you have shared services, how you have upstart organizations that are providing important Jewish content and spaces, connect with larger organizations so that you have a streamlined overhead. We should not get into the mindset of just rebuilding, taking whatever that was there before and just putting it back. We should be thinking about what should a new delivery of Jewish life look like for our community, and hopefully not only build back, but build back better and stronger and in a more efficient way. So the goal is to be smart and efficient, to do more with less, to be focused on function, not on form. Easier to say than to do, but I think the future of our Jewish community depends on our rationalizing our current institutions. What are the opportunities? They say that crisis is a crucible to innovation. Many of the innovations that we now take for granted that have changed our lives dramatically were born out of crisis. We've seen innovation since March 1, perhaps the most notable being the migration to Zoom and other online platforms. And it's done a variety of very positive things for our community, although there have been some negative dimensions, and let me touch on them briefly. Focusing on the positive. In many ways, for those who are already engaged, Zoom has been a door to even greater engagement. It's erased boundaries, geographic, institutional, denominational, economic. For many of us, we can now listen to shiurim classes from around the world, from people who weren't putting their content online in a live way. You can ask questions of people around the globe each day on subjects that interest you. It's widened our horizons and actually very little barrier to entry. It's mostly free. It's created even new methods for interaction. At UJA, since COVID began, we now do a weekly pre-Shabbat community-wide gathering that is deliberately bringing together, intentionally, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist Jewish leaders each week to teach words of Torah, of words of inspiration, and to sing the Nigunim. We're putting together an audience who has never been exposed beyond their own denominational boundary to the other rabbis, the great Jewish leaders that we have in the community. And one of the benefits is it's accessible, people are joining, and it also shows that what unites the community, I truly believe, is much greater than what divides us. So those are just some of the positives. Another positive dimension, even for some of the less engaged, for some, walking through the door of a shul or a JCC was too high a barrier. Either they were uncomfortable, they felt intimidated, they didn't know enough, they didn't know people. You can join an online service at a shul now without being a member. In fact, there are synagogues in our community that now report that they have thousands of people joining in their weekly Shabbat services online, dimensions greater than before. Now, time will tell whether those people who came engaged this way will sustain, or once this is no longer the mode and it's hopefully back to a more traditional environment, will they continue? But it's possible that there are people who are less engaged, who going into a shul was a barrier too high, that this has been actually a door opening, this online Zoom. The barriers, of course, the negative dimensions is, well, for some, it's a way of getting in. For many who love the shul experience, who love the experience of doing Kedusha together, singing in a shul. You can't sing together on Zoom. You can't hug. You can't shake the hand of your neighbor on Shabbos over Zoom. So there's a personal contact, there's a communal experience around davening that clearly doesn't exist. There's also a challenge around technology. Some elderly, much more challenged around technology. So not being able to go outside, increasingly isolated by all of this. And then there are people who can't afford Wi-Fi. And there is such a population in the Jewish community. And we need to understand how isolating and challenging this period is for them. I think probably my greatest concern is about the implications of Jewish engagement. UJA spends so much time on how we engage our youth Jewishly around Israel, feel a sense of real deep stickiness and connection. So many of the most formative experiences that we think about are, a trip to Israel, touch and feel and smell the country, walk on a beach in Tel Aviv, meet the Chayal on a bus, or going to camp. So many Jewish children who do not go to day school, camps are critical. It's the first camp experience that becomes the connection to Jewish engagement. How do you do that if you can't get on a plane and go to Israel? How do you do that when your camps are closed? How do you do that when you don't have this face-to-face encounter? So these huge implications, how do we build Jewish engagement virtually if this is a longer-term reality, is something we need to focus on. And I also, beyond what I mentioned, the elderly when it comes to technology, we need to understand that even after there's a virus, certainly a vaccine, depending on the nature of it, it still may be unsafe for elderly, for people with pre-existing conditions to go outside. Gary Rosenblatt wrote a very touching article a couple of weeks ago about how he signed up to be a volunteer for his shul to deliver meals to people in need. And the rabbi very gently called Gary and said, Gary, you're 71, you can't volunteer. And Gary turned around and said, well, then have them deliver a meal to me so I can have the friendship. But it's a serious question. You know, the title of his article was, Is 70 the New 90? We need to think about the implications of this time on those who are incredibly vibrant, who are, you know, in fact, voluntarism. Our Jewish community centers, our food pantries are overwhelmingly served by baby boomer volunteers. They're a critical infrastructure, not really spoken about, in providing services for the Jewish community. What if they can't continue to volunteer in the same way? What are the implications of that for them and for our community? What is the impact of COVID on New York City itself, on the Jewish community of New York? Even before COVID started, because of President Trump tax laws, not a political statement, but simply there were tax law changes in December 2017 that did away with the deductibility of state, local, and property taxes, leading many high net worth New Yorkers to begin to move out of the state. Now, people are concerned, you hear about concerns about living in very highly dense communities. People concerned about sending their kids to public schools, given the density of the classes. People concerned about getting on subways, which is such a vital means of transportation for our community. Will there be a flight to suburbs, particularly if the ability to remotely work becomes the continuing vogue? Will people decide to not spend as much time in dense urban centers? So significant challenges ahead for New York. Aliyah. The Jewish Agency anticipates significantly increased Aliyah as a result of COVID-19. I'm more skeptical, but as of late last week, they expect 250,000 olim over the next 3 to 5 years. So that's 50,000 olim a year. Currently, it's around 30,000 a year. That's a dramatic change with dramatic consequences for Israel. Positive if it happens, we'll see. I think part of it, though, was it was a time when people thought that Israel had beat COVID in a way that America had not. And now we're going to wait and see what happens with that. One last trend and then a conclusion. Anti-Semitism. We know that anti-Semitism was growing in America pre-COVID. In fact, it seems like an eternity ago. But in January of the new year, so 6 months ago, we put together the march and rally across the Brooklyn Bridge because there were almost daily anti-Semitic incidents in Brooklyn and other parts of New York, and obviously the murders in Jersey City, Muncie. Those challenges mean, so you don't have as many, even though we've seen in the last couple of weeks, a couple of incidents again. While the number of violent attacks has ebbed, the amount of anti-Semitism online, much of it around COVID, has grown enormously. People saying that Jews brought COVID, people saying that Jews brought COVID to profit from COVID, and that the vaccine is going to be from Israel so that they can reap the profits of the vaccine. Crazy, insane stuff, but anti-Semitism is going to continue to grow. Obviously, a different subject, the civil unrest, we can hold for hours and hours in a separate conversation about racial injustice, and there is racial injustice, but it's a complicated time in America for Jews, and I think anti-Semitism is going to continue to grow, and that COVID has only fueled it in very serious ways. So in conclusion, I think the catchphrase for COVID is that we're living in unprecedented times. In many ways, that's true, but I think we can also try to learn from past experiences. I was on a call earlier, actually late last week, with Jonathan Sana, the prominent Jewish historian, who spoke about the impact of like other crises on the Jewish community. So he said, for example, in the wake of the Great Depression, Jewish institutions had a dramatic decline in membership. Temple Emmanuel, your neighbor in the city, lost 44% of its membership during the Great Depression. Similarly, during the Great Financial Crisis of 2008, non-Orthodox shul membership declined by 20%. The generation of the 30s, Jonathan Sana said, were considered ignorant Jews. Their literacy Jewishly suffered by virtue of what happened during the 30s, and it didn't really recover until the 50s. It's a cautionary tale. How do we prevent that from happening in this moment and ensure the continuity of Jewish engagement? Now, at the same time, it was fascinating, Sana mentioned that during the Depression, because of Depression, we went from a 6-day work week to a 5-day work week, enabling many more Jews to observe Shabbat and engage Jewishly in community, and that this was a practice that well outlasted the Depression. Look, our own history, UJA was built, was started in 1917 as World War I was raging, with millions of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, impoverished, enormous sickness, and many of the most sustaining institutions, the Hebrew Free Loan Society predated that, but was built up dramatically during that time. Many of the JCCs, communal organizations, all sprung up in those moments of crisis and became enormous anchors of Jewish community going forward. So what would the future look like? When you're going through a crisis, it's hard to see past it. But let's remember 9/11, a smaller crisis than this, but most said that downtown New York City was done. No one would ever work or live in a large building tower. Well, we all know downtown came back stronger than ever. Jewish history more broadly, we're a people that's not surprised by crises. We've lived through many, many, many. And today we're the most successful diasporic Jewish community in the history of the world. We can't be complacent about the emerging challenges out there, but I truly believe, and this is Be'ezrat Hashem, that our Jewish community will have the resourcefulness and the resilience to innovate and to continue to endure and to flourish. So thanks very much again for having me. And Rachel, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I know that I speak on behalf of the synagogue when I thank you for the day-to-day work you're doing in town, in the service sector, or in the Jewish institutional life. Certainly before COVID, it was significant enough, and now just so acutely so. So thank you very much. I also want to thank your sister, Sandra, who's so magnificent in her own right, but it was a beautiful introduction. It didn't get too dangerous. I thought it was just fine. I have 4 young kids, so we have those same squabbles over board games in my house as well. And I'm sure there'll be some revisionist history in who won which game. And then I also want to welcome your parents. How wonderful that they could be with us tonight. So welcome. So there's so many questions that come up, and let me actually just preface this by saying for anyone who's joining our program for the first time tonight that you can submit questions through the Q&A function, and then I'm happy to relay them to Eric. And I know we already have one so far. Let me ask you though, just starting out, what is the Jewish population under the umbrella of Federation in New York?
So it's roughly, we're about to do another community study, but as of 2011, it was between 1.5, 1.6 million, and that represents the 5 boroughs of New York City, all of Westchester, and all of Long Island. If you add the, New Jersey, Northern New Jersey, and the Connecticut areas, it's at least another 1.5 million more. But I focus on the catchment of UJA is New York City, Westchester, and Long Island.
And so, I was just having a conversation tonight with my brother-in-law and sister-in-law who live in Connecticut about the numbers of people leaving the city. Of course, many of them are going to Connecticut, some others to Israel. Do you have a sense at all in terms of how many are going? I have 2 kids at Ramaz, and people are estimating maybe 10% will be gone when we go back in September. Can you give us any more detail about what's happening with our population?
Well, there are 2 types of instances. I mean, there's, the Aliyah question, and there again, I think it's much too early. Jewish Agency to Israel, the Sachnut, has seen a dramatic rise in people from North America, many from New York, who have opened an application for Aliyah, but opening an application and actually making Aliyah are 2 very, very different things. And it's not at all clear how many ultimately will. I suspect there will be an increase, but I don't think, well, we'll see whether it's to the scale they expect.
Is Israel even open right now?
Israel is not open, but if you are seeking to make Aliyah, you can, it's all being run, it used to be run out of various ministries. It's now the Jewish Agency. The Sachnut is responsible for Aliyah, and they are mostly in exceptional cases. I know people who have, in fact, we've been involved in facilitating some with the Jewish Agency who have been allowed to apply and receive visas to actually come to Israel. But it's, in other words, to relocate, to make Aliyah. We also know that Israel, the Masa programs, were given visas, and as of 2 weeks ago, it was complete green light. Last week, there was like a yellow flag saying that we still hope to bring Masa students the gap years, but there's some lingering uncertainty. Many of these programs are scheduled to get there for Elul and would be leaving in mid-August and quarantining as groups for 2 weeks before going into the various yeshivas and seminaries and other gap year programs. We'll see. It's up for grabs. But
and what about, yeah, go ahead.
People leaving, there are a lot of people who believe that New York City coming back to school full-time will be behind other less densely packed communities. So again, anecdotally, and this is also a question of those who can afford to do so, we know of a number of people, again, I don't know if it's 10%, 5%, I don't know how many percent it is, who have chosen to spend this coming year out of New York, out of New York City, whether it's, in Westchester or on Long Island or even further away places, and putting their kids into schools in non-city settings. But I don't have any good data on that yet. But anecdotally, we know that there is concern about, how long city schools will stay. Will they reopen? Will they stay remote? And if they reopen, how long will they stay that way?
Would you mind speaking a little bit more towards the Jewish day schools and the assistance you're providing? I know that you yourself have been so involved with Manhattan Day School and Ramaz as well. And I would love to hear a little bit more about the partnership with UJA right now.
So day schools, year in, year out, we know, and we learned this in the wake of the great financial crisis in 2008, one of the great challenges of American Jewish life is the affordability of day schools. If you have 2 or 3 children, let alone 4 or 5 or more, even if you are very, very solidly middle class, you cannot afford to send all of your children to day school. And, there have been small ways of trying to change that, both philanthropically and through increased government funding. But still today, day school is highly unaffordable. And at this time, there are a lot of people who are now struggling all of a sudden in the Jewish community who, with their kids in yeshivas and day schools, we thought it was critically important to give that population, sort of the newly vulnerable, and the ability to continue to send their children to yeshiva, day schools this year. And so this is not a standalone solution, but we committed $2 million to any school that raises new dollars for funding up to certain caps per school, we will match them $1 to $1. So the idea is, our $2 million will lead to $4 million that will be additional scholarship funding for day school families. This is part of a much broader effort at UJA. We started a day school challenge fund 3 or 4 years ago, where we raised a $55 million challenge fund. UJA put $20 million in from our own endowment. And we said to every school, roughly speaking, for every dollar in new endowment you raise, we'll put in 50 cents. So if you raise $5 million in a fund, we'll give you $2.5 million in that fund, and then it will draw a spending rate to help support the schools each year. Our day schools need a lot greater financial stability. None of our day schools has appropriate endowment. And so we're mightily motivated to try to get the day schools to be affordable. But it's a long way ahead. And government has, a Teach NYS, which we partner, it's an OU vehicle, but we work with the OU and give funding to Teach NYS, has made some very significant strides in government funding too. So slowly but surely, but for this next year or two ahead, day schools are going to have a big challenge providing to allow all of their students to come and having the scholarship budget that will allow them to do it.
Thank you. One of the members of our audience has asked if you could speak with a little more detail about some of the institutions that might merge or should merge in the wake of what's going on.
So I'm not going to play God, but certainly in the non-Orthodox community, there's an enormous, far many more synagogues than there is demand for synagogues. Many of them have their own preschools. Many of them have their own camp programs. So each one has a director of admissions, has a marketing person, has a this or that. You could bring a lot of, even if you don't physically merge the synagogues themselves, bring these common programs together, have a single overhead, and you could rationalize the service in a much, much stronger way. Look, I think if you look at almost every sector of Jewish life and you look and you map which organizations are doing what, there are so many organizations that do similar things. And everyone wants to be the queen and king of their own institution. But I think we need to look, and I think particularly as funders, we need to look at where there is duplication, where there is overlap, and do we need to have 22 community centers in New York? We have 22 separate Jewish community centers in New York. I think there's probably some excess capacity in yeshivas in the community. But again, I'm not playing God. I just think we need to think about how can we maybe even use technology that to rationalize, make learning a little less expensive, and cut away some of the expense of our community, because we're not going to be able to afford it, at least for the near to intermediate term.
Would you mind speaking a little bit about Zoom and what UJA is doing to reach people virtually? When all of this happened as a synagogue, we realized right away that we needed to create a virtual community because people now more than ever needed the synagogue, and all of a sudden they couldn't physically be together. So we worked hard to put together daily programs and classes, virtual communal davening. What is UJA doing in that respect? And what are you doing, say, with seniors or where there's a barrier to technology and allowing people to access what you're offering?
So I'd say in a typical week, we probably have 50 online offerings, and we help fund probably truly 500 others. In fact, one of the challenges we have is, will there be a Zoom fatigue that sets in? You know, we've been doing this for a while now, and will the same, you know, instinct, and I think the people who are engaged will continue to engage online. By the way, if we stay in, you know, in reduced ability to go back into physical buildings, for those of us who are engaged, it's the sort of the only way, and it's a very rich way because there's so much offering out there and much that you wouldn't have been able to access before. I think the challenge is less the engaged. I think the challenge is how do you engage the less engaged, the unengaged, which is such a significant part of our work and the work of so many other organizations, when the strategies that have been most successful for all these years, which really are about mifgash, about, you know, person-to-person connection, be it at camp, on Israel trips, summer experiences. How do you do that for those who are reluctant to engage? I particularly worry about Israel. We know that many, not all, but many of our younger generation are less connected to Israel than their parents and grandparents were. Nothing substitutes for a physical trip to Israel, to actually see the sights and sounds and experience Israel. How do you build at a time where we desperately need to instill greater connection and sense of identity with Israel? How do you do that if you physically can't get on a plane? You can't even bring, you know, we fund every year very significantly shlichim, hundreds of shlichim and shinshinim that are in both synagogues, camps, schools, communities, and they're the best and brightest of Israel. They come into a synagogue, a day school, a camp, and on a college campus, and they interact with our children, our grandchildren, and it's very important. Although shlichim and shinshinim are mostly not coming either. And so there are a lot of downsides to this current reality. And you know, if this all ends very suddenly and we're back to the old ways, well, then we can go back to the old ways of engaging. But if we don't, we're going to need to figure out compelling models of engagement that are virtual and they're not in person.
So the other question that was submitted on the chat is actually the flip side of Zoom, and the fact that many people are truly very comfortable at home listening to Zoom programs. In fact, in some cases, I know for us as a shul, when we have speakers, we are sometimes getting more people than we might if something was happening in person at shul. So the question is, do we think people are going to be willing to pay dues, especially as we approach the high holidays, and in particularly in light of the fact that some of the unemployment benefits are coming to an end? So I guess maybe also more broadly, what you see happening to synagogues.
We have a division that works with synagogues, mostly struggling synagogues, and mostly from the non-Orthodox community. The synagogues are very worried. I mean, a lot of their, there are sort of haves and have-nots. I mean, there are some prominent non-Orthodox synagogues that are seeing extraordinary growth, literally seeing thousands of people join their weekly services where, you know, they have very high-profile rabbis and leaders who are drawing crowds. So, you know, you don't have to be a member now to, you know, to hear the best and brightest, or perceived as being the best and brightest Jewish leaders. The struggle is there are lots of synagogues that rely on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur and the appeal on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur to fund their operations. And it's coming from a segment of the Jewish community that is only going into those synagogues, mostly on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, with the exception of a bar or bat mitzvah. And so synagogues are, of a certain sector, incredibly concerned about whether the funds will come in, both because the people see the same sense of return on their funding. You know, I'm getting an online experience, it's very different, not reserving a seat in the second row that I like near the door. You know, there are lots of differences. The other thing is, to your point, affordability. You know, there are people who are less able to pay the dues than they once did. And a lot of these synagogues then, COVID has been an accelerator of history. Every weak synagogue pre-COVID, in an accelerated way that may have taken 5 to 10 years to get to that point, is now really stressed. So they not only need to sort of sustain what they did last year, they need, because of the current environment, to generate that much more. So you're going to see, there's no question, you're going to see synagogues that shutter. There's been in the news 2 prominent synagogues, Reform synagogues in Brooklyn, that are now talking about a merger, which would be a wonderful thing, because you're rationalizing community resources, and I think that you can still remain very strong. But I think that there are entities that are going to be just fine come Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, even if it's mostly online. And I think that there are going to be entities looking for dues and other funding who are going to struggle in a very bad way.
Right. So, you know, I like that phrase very much, that about the acceleration. And it is making me think a little bit about globalization. And I was wondering, are you doing added work with other federations around the country that you might not have been doing, collaborations through Zoom, for example, or collaborations with programming where the audience is just opened up more nationally or more regionally?
We've always done national programming with other federations. We've done, you know, in the wake of Zoom, we've had thousands of people come together for some federation-wide programming, many of it, in fact, put on by my own federation. But I think that where we've worked, and I think very effectively, and I give enormous credit to the national system too, Jewish Federations of North America, the umbrella, there were institutions, Jewish institutions, that in March and April were just, you know, struggling so badly, and didn't know what funding they could access, didn't know whether they were eligible for PPP loans, were they eligible for other philanthropic loans and grants that were out there from across the community. So we, for our local community, Jewish institutions, synagogues, day schools, anyone, created a task force, and those synagogues and others who didn't have the wherewithal to sort of navigate this on their own could call our team, who would say to them, you could qualify for this, let's help you get this. And nationally, the federation system was really front and center, led by the national system. And we probably did nationally and locally 100+ seminars on PPP access for tens of thousands of Jewish communal leaders to say, here's the nuts and bolts, here's who you apply, if you have a problem, call this, putting all the resources online. And our community in the aggregate, we think, accessed around $250 million in PPP funding. And we think, you know, again, not all of it result of our expertise, but certainly it was a way of using a national platform. Similarly, PPE, it's personal protective equipment, not payroll protection plan loans. Personal protective equipment is going to be a continuing mainstay of schools, synagogues, senior centers, not-for-profits of every stripe, and it's incredibly expensive. And it's hard for an individual organization to have the the pipeline to get this PPE on a regular basis at a standard price or at a reasonable price, and to ensure a reasonable flow of product. So we originally started this locally. We've now also allied with the national system, and we have a national cooperative for Jewish institutions to join to give a stable, steady supply at a reasonable price of personal protective equipment. For our local agencies, we're also funding a lot of that. So our agencies don't have the budget to pay for this personal protective equipment. So we've been doing a lot of grants to those not-for-profits so that they can continue to do their work. So I think there are a lot of ways where you're seeing national collaboration. We're even working with private foundations. The national system brought together a group of very prominent national foundations, and they created a Jewish communal, essentially COVID relief response fund to provide both interest-free loans and grants to Jewish institutions around the country. So you're seeing national collaborations, both through federation and with federation and foundations, and I hope that that becomes more of the new norm.
Amazing. Just one final question, and then I'll turn it back over to the rabbi to close. So, you know, many of our members are very involved as financial donors to UJA, and we know that in the, I'm sure they do it with the deepest honor, but I know that in the wake of the crisis, many people individually have stepped up in a very tremendous way to assist. But one of the amazing things about UJA is the volunteer infrastructure that it has created. And you talked about the baby boomers who have always volunteered in the past and might not be able to at this time because they're in a higher risk group. What volunteer opportunities are available in addition to those of our members who might already be participating financially?
Right, so if you go on our website, UJA, and UJANY.org, UJFedNY.org, excuse me. There's an entire listing of resources of volunteerism. So there are lots of volunteer opportunities, but just to give you some examples. So if you're, again, if many of them require COVID tests, food pantries, again, now are working with volunteers to deliver food. We have digital choice food pantries across the community where people order online what they want from pantries, and then they have them delivered. There are lots of chesed opportunities. There are online needs where you teach a skill you might have online to, it could be a school-age child who has homework challenges. It could be to seniors who have technology challenges, a whole array of both virtual and in-person volunteer experiences. I urge you to go on and lots of opportunity out there.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. This was just absolutely wonderful. We're so grateful for your time. And as I said earlier, the work that you're doing every day to support our community, especially the most vulnerable. So with that, let me turn it back over to Rabbi Babich.
Thank you.
Eric, as Rachel just mentioned, thank you so much for your insightful presentation this evening. I know definitely involved in highly critical work, especially during this highly sensitive time. Just one question to you before we close. Many people are very anxious with the upcoming high holiday season that's upon us. So from your perspective and your work at the UJA, what type of planning are you doing? And also what type of services are you able to offer shuls and different organizations that are planning services? Sometimes they need permits to use public spaces. Sometimes they need, as you mentioned, maybe assistance, with the protective gear. So what are you planning in preparation for the upcoming high holidays this year?
So first of all, there's a resource page that we have for synagogues, not only in terms of reopening, and various issues relating to it from a safety perspective, but an entire resource kit on high holiday services. And it has, we have an entire team who's devoted to assisting synagogues around those efforts. So again, probably the easiest thing to do is, that's on our website as well, and I'll get it right this time. It's UJAFedNY.org. But more fundamentally, if any synagogue that's interested, and any synagogue administrator, rabbi who wants to access the resources, they should contact me, and I'm happy to put them in touch with the people at UJA who are working on it. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and frankly, there's still a lot of uncertainty. How many people, if any, will we be able to put into our shuls come Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? You know, we've been going in a good direction, but we know that you know, those directions can change. But I think our role is trying to provide the resources and, for example, the permits, you know, help securing various needs, but less the content. The content, we have professionals who are out there suggesting, but they work with the local rabbeim around how do you put online programming that is compelling.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric. And you know, according to our tradition, ultimately, Hashem, the Almighty, is the one who sustains all and feeds all. He sustains all living creatures, but we know that he very often appoints representatives and emissaries to do to execute his work in this world. And you and your involvement is most definitely one of his representatives to feed those in need and to support the different organizations. So we bless you with continued health and success. And please God, that you shouldn't have to make these difficult decisions. No one should have to make these difficult decisions. And as you know, as evidence in the past, sometimes people grow and organizations grow, and even greater at the end of these difficult times. And please God, may we see that as well this time around. We want to thank everyone for. We want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Everyone should be well, safe, and cool during these next couple of days. And have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much again, Eric, for your time tonight.
Thank you. Be well.